Their fruitless quest to crush Vietnamese communism cost the United States some 10,000 aircraft, and of those 10,000, nearly half were claimed by the DShK, the Soviet counterpart to the M2 Browning. In terms of power, reliability, and longevity, the American M2 has but one equal, competing, endlessly it seems, with the Soviet answer to Browning's 50 caliber beast. Born into the same generation as the M2 itself, the DShK materialized from the ruthless politics of the early USSR, and arrived onto the scene as the world braced itself for another global conflict. Since 1938, the Soviet 50 cal has been the first choice heavy machine gun for those aligned with the Soviet Union and then Russian Federation, serving across a century's worth of conflicts through to the modern day. From defending the motherland itself from an existential invasion to becoming the bane of Cold War-era helicopters and even being turned on its creators themselves in Afghanistan and Ukraine, the DShK has racked up a similar rap sheet of action as the M2, but it has been fated to live in the Browning's shadow since the 1930s. So what led to the DShK coming to be? How has the weapon performed and evolved over the last century? And to what degree does the Soviet 50 cal stack up to Browning's venerable M2? The story of the DShK traces all the way back to the turbulent early years of Soviet history, and its development is closely intertwined with this period's especially brutal politics. By the time the First World War had ended in November 1918, what was once the Russian Empire had buckled under the weight of its backwards feudal system and centuries of understandable resentment toward the ruling Tsarist class, giving way to possibly the most consequential revolution of the 20th century. For the first time in human history, communism was to be the philosophy of government for the nation that emerged from the revolutions of 1917, and a strong national arms industry quickly became a major priority. You see, when the new Soviet leadership bailed on the shitshow of a war their predecessor had so kindly dragged them into, the Russian Empire's forces were equipped entirely with foreign arms, save for the iconic Mosin-Nagant bolt-action rifle. And for the commies shouting from the rooftops about the supremacy of their collectivist system, a reliance on filthy, foreign capitalist arms wasn't a great look. With a violent and bloody civil war gripping the fractured former monarchy, this great socialist people's arms industry was put on the back burner. However, it would be from the failures of Civil War-era communist policies that this industry eventually came to fruition. While Lenin's war communism had kept the Red Army armed and fed, a great deal of the Soviet economy was sacrificed for it to actually work. A devastating fiscal failure that directly led to his new economic policy in 1921. The imaginatively named NEP itself didn't really do much to bolster the Soviet arms industry, representing instead a slight retreat from full-blown communism to address the economic clusterfuck of the post-Civil War Union. But it was under this policy that the Kovrov Machine Gun Factory's design office was established in 1924. Fully incorporating the nascent institution into the Soviet system. Kovrov itself had only been established in the twilight of the Tsarist days, but it wasn't lacking in talent, being headed by Vladimir Fedorov, designer of the Fedorov automatic rifle, along with his assistants, Vasily Degtyaryov and Georgy Shpeigin. As the young communist state slowly rebuilt itself up from years of constant war with both itself and the world, Vasily Degtyaryov began work on providing his nation with a homegrown machine gun design, producing the DP-27, a light machine gun that continues to see use even today, while Shpeigin and Fedorov focused their efforts on submachine guns. By the time Degtyaryov's first machine gun had emerged, there had been a major shakeup in the Soviet leadership. And it would be this radical, revolutionary even, new leadership that birthed the DShK. Lenin's death in 1924 left a massive power vacuum in the fledgling Soviet Union, and the man who managed to fill it soon turned out to be the once little-known secretary, Joseph Stalin, the absolute last person Lenin wanted to succeed him. Unfortunately for Lenin, he was dead, and Stalin had the will and the ruthlessness to commandeer the reins of the Soviet system for his own ends, which he wasted no time in doing. As it relates to the DShK, it's important to recognize that the weapon's development occurred mostly under the auspices of Stalin's 5-year plans. The Soviet arms industry benefited immensely from the brute force industrialization of the USSR in both their development and production capabilities, both of which facilitated the creation of the DShK. In 1927, as Stalin solidified his position atop the Communist Empire, the arms designers at Kovrov were tasked by the Red Army with developing a large-caliber machine gun to engage aircraft and armored vehicles. Now, it's unclear if they took inspiration from the then-in-development Browning 50 cal, but the Soviets likely knew of the Moorman's project in some capacity, though again there's nothing to definitively say exactly where the idea came from. Regardless of why, Degtyaryov spent the next 3 years getting his toes wet with high-caliber machine guns, first designing the DK, literally the Degtyaryov Heavy Machine Gun. Seeing little wrong with his previous DP-27, Degtyaryov's new weapon was essentially just an upscaled version of his light machine gun, a pipeline identical to Browning's heavy machine gun design. While initially firing a cartridge similar to the 12.7 by 81mm Vickers round, the Soviets' own new 12.7 by 108mm rimless round was settled on in 1930, with the DK itself entering service by the decade's midpoint. Despite its pedigree, the new DK was a monumental failure in comparison to its predecessor. Strangely, for an HMG, it was solely magazine-fed, and with a maximum capacity of a mere 30 rounds, along with some horrendous reliability issues, the DK was never going to be practical, resulting in only a small number ever being made. Luckily though, there was an obvious solution. Just develop a belt feed for the DK, make it a little more reliable, and call it a day. So Georgy Shpagin was brought in to do just that for the Soviet HMG. Shpagin's contribution to the weapon was an innovative and highly reliable rotary belt feed, and after half a decade of work, the revised machine gun emerged as the DShK in 1938, the sh rammed in the middle of the acronym representing Shpagin's efforts on the project, thus being the Degtyaryov-Shpagin Heavy Machine Gun. The new weapon arrived at just the right time too. A certain angry Austrian was increasingly gobbling up Germany's neighbours, and the scourge of war was once more set to plague the world. Soviet arms production kicked into overdrive with Stalin's third 5-year plan as the so-called Great Patriotic War loomed. But before we delve into its combat record, let's first discuss the DShK's employment and its role in the Soviet battlefield doctrine. If there was ever a weapon to fully embody the heavy part of heavy machine gun, it was certainly the DShK. The weapon alone weighs some 34 kilograms, much of which is just in its barrel, and when combined with its M1931 mount, the bulk of the weapon ballooned to 157 kilograms, almost 100 kilograms more than the Browning and its tripod. Its weight was just a consequence of compromise though, as this so-called universal mount provides incredible versatility for the DShK. The mount itself is wheeled, allowing for easier movement, and this single assembly can be configured in two distinct ways. The first as a low-to-the-ground anti-infantry mount with an integrated seat for the gunner, or as a more stable, raised tripod for use firing on aerial targets above. From these positions, the DShK is effective out to around 2 kilometers, and while it can theoretically fire at nearly 600 rounds per minute, in combat it has a practical fire rate of around 125 rounds per minute. Fire rate was a critical consideration, however, as like the original M2, the DShK's barrel lacks a quick change mechanism, instead relying on a wrench to unscrew both the barrel and locking stud, which I imagine isn't a terribly fun thing to have to do in combat. Anyway, in another similarity to the Browning, the DShK uses spade grips to give the gunner better control over the weapon, and although the DShK was never particularly noteworthy for its accuracy, the weapon has likewise been adapted for sniping purposes. Furthermore, while it did have a new belt feed system thanks to Bane, these belts only carried 50 rounds, severely limiting the weapon's sustained fire capacity. In terms of its actual deployment, the weapon was to have a 3 to 5 man crew, and its effectiveness was entirely dependent on the crew's coordination, along with efficient transportation and advantageous placement of the weapon itself. The weapon filled a practically identical role to the M2 in both infantry and vehicle-mounted configurations, firing on personnel or penetrating cover and light armor. But since it has mostly been employed against aircraft, we'll focus on that instead. Mounted on the M1931, or really any stable surface angled upwards, the DShK was fired either in short, controlled bursts and the aim adjusted in between, or just with the trigger held down and aiming constantly adjusted throughout. The ideal time to fire was as an enemy aircraft entered or exited a dive, as the aircraft would be in its most predictable flight pattern. And in well-trained hands, the DShK could easily tear aircraft apart. Except at night though. The weapon's enormous muzzle flash made actually seeing what you were shooting at near impossible, so often a separate observer called out adjustments to the crew during night firing. Overall, in terms of its roles, penetrative power, and ease of use, the DShK was a competent competitor to the M2. But as you'll soon see, the DShK's actual battlefield impact during World War II paled in comparison to its American rival. After the Soviets helped start the Second World War by carving up Poland with the Nazis, they were soon on the defensive, as the fascists predictably set their sights on the expansive communist empire. Soviet troops first got their hands on the DShK in 1940, while the Germans took a brief holiday in Western Europe. But as the infamous Operation Barbarossa was launched the next year, the fanatical Nazis, and especially their pilots, quickly became personally acquainted with the Red 50 cal. On an interesting note, just as they had with the M2, the Germans also began capturing DShKs for their own use. Though when compared to Germany's homegrown developments, the Soviet machine guns were leagues behind. But in fairness, the Nazis didn't have a single infantry weapon that even came close to the raw penetrative power of the communist DShK. Nonetheless, at the outset of the war, the DShK played seconds in the anti-aircraft role to the more widely available quad-mounted Maxim machine guns the Soviets favored. But by 1944, the DShK had, on paper at least, entirely replaced the Maxims for air defense, given its greater power, range, and versatility. Most Soviet battalions included an anti-aircraft platoon of 3 DShKs. However, in the endless bureaucratic comedy that was the Soviet Union, the actual number of these fluctuated immensely throughout the conflict. In addition to infantry, a number of vehicles also mounted the DShK during the war. The IS-2 heavy tank, ISU-152 self-propelled guns, the T-40 light amphibious tank, and Gaz AA trucks, along with some less common mountings on ships and trains. Aircraft were the primary prey for these DShKs, but they also routinely engaged men and machines on the ground, and also found use in a supportive capacity, marking targets for tanks with tracer rounds. If it feels like I'm kind of grasping at straws for things to discuss here, it's because I really am. Despite the USSR's massive industrial capacity producing nearly 1.5 million machine guns throughout the war, only 9,000 of these were DShKs, not even 1% of the amount of Brownings produced. As such, it's hard to find solid information on exactly when, where, and how these DShKs were used, outside of the generalized stuff I've already mentioned. But on a more positive note, the DShK's similarity to the DP-27 did help speed up what little production there was. However, even in small numbers, the DShKs that saw combat were still immensely effective at downing German aircraft, penetrating light vehicles, suppressing the enemy, and protecting infantrymen. It certainly made a massive impact on the Red Army troops themselves, who affectionately nicknamed it the DShK, the Russian word for beloved, as a play on its acronym. The DShK's story in World War II is a much humbler tale than the more famous American 50 cal, more a background extra than the star of the show. But it was a start, if only a small one, and as the Cold War kicked off, the DShK really began to hit its stride. As Hitler began eyeing up the business end of his pistol, work began at Kovrov on providing the still largely unknown DShK with its one and only major upgrade. Several notable improvements influenced by the war were introduced, including a simplified and less fragile muzzle brake, an easier barrel change mechanism, and a completely overhauled feeding system. The new model was much more robust and reliable than its predecessor, with small-scale production beginning in February 1945, and a small number managed to see combat before the hammer and sickle flew over Berlin. It wouldn't be until after the war that the improved DShK was formally adopted though, but in 1946 the DShK 38/46 was standardized, though it's better known as the DShK M. Within moments of the war in Europe ending, the Soviets sought to export their high-caliber machine gun to sympathetic armed forces around the world, first turning their attention to East Asia, where the Chinese Civil War had reignited in the wake of colonial Japanese occupation. The Big Chairman's Chinese Communist Party claimed to have acquired some 4,800 DShKs from the Soviets, utilizing them for the same anti-aircraft and infantry support roles the Red Army had done. The DShK also unmistakably made an impression on the Chinese, and before their dramatic breakup with the USSR, they obtained licenses and tooling to produce their own DShK clone known as the Type 54, a weapon which remained a popular choice for PLA tanks and light vehicles until the late 90s. With Korea descending into war shortly thereafter, the DShK was once more to be the Commies' HMG of choice. Both North Korean and Chinese forces employed the DShK throughout the conflict, mostly as a fierce anti-aircraft and anti-vehicle weapon, though it was also occasionally directed at fortified positions and infantrymen. In the mountainous terrain of Korea, Communist forces found that moving the hefty Red 50 cal was exceedingly difficult, so to resolve this issue, the weapon was mounted on trucks. But after American aircraft began decimating these vehicles in response, their usefulness was limited to night hours only. While DShK-equipped forces in Korea proved tough opponents for the UN coalition, the weapon still largely languished in the shadow of the M2. But not for long. The capitalist West, and the US specifically, had become intimately familiar with the DShK. However, in a fatal bit of hubris, they were satisfied that their own 50 cal was superior. The Western military planners seemed to overlook the very obvious fact that Communist forces now had a dependable heavy machine gun that could be easily exported into any of the brewing Cold War conflicts. This hubris quickly proved deadly, as not far away, another band of rebellious Reds were making excellent use of the Soviet heavy machine gun. Into the 1950s, the DShK still flew under much of the world's radars, but by the time the war in Vietnam was over, never again would the Soviet 50 cal be underestimated. As the native populations of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos took up arms against their French colonizers, they quickly received assistance from the newly formed People's Republic of China, who provided them with a number of DShKs. Used primarily for anti-aircraft purposes, the DShKs truly made a name for themselves at the pivotal Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Nearly 150 cals were deployed in the hills surrounding the French base, destroying 62 aircraft attempting to resupply the besieged garrison and damaging another 180. In this deciding hour for French colonialism in Southeast Asia, the DShK proved to be a major factor in the Viet Minh's victory, especially as the French believed they lacked significant anti-air capabilities. And as the United States ramped up their involvement in the region's affairs, the DShK's legend only continued to bloom. Until 1966, the DShK mostly remained in North Vietnam, serving as a highly effective means for villages to protect themselves from American airstrikes. But once it arrived in the South, American helicopters soon found themselves in its crosshairs. Typically, 3 guns were set up around potential landing zones, ambushing American forces just off the ground when helicopters had little room to maneuver or climb out of danger. Proper training on the weapon was hard to come by for the Viet Cong, but that didn't matter much. Their DShKs were the perfect weapon to destroy helicopters with, along with the RPG-2 and 7, though it was also used against infantry as well, if less often. Aircraft flying low and slow were ideal targets for the Viet Cong's 50 cals, but the DShK proved so effective and accessible that in 1967 a group of elderly men shot down a supersonic F-4 Phantom using the weapon. Despite this highly effective use by the VC, the weapon was never available in the numbers they desired, even with supplies from both China and the USSR, but they made more than the most of what they had. By the time they courageously abandoned the South, the US had lost thousands of helicopters and planes throughout the infamous quagmire, many to the DShK, and the weapon emerged from the war as a highly desirable armament for communist-aligned forces. In fact, it would be this experience in Vietnam that ensured later American vehicles were designed to be resistant to the formidable 12.7mm round. With a newfound respect and acclaim, the DShK had truly established itself as a superb heavy machine gun, and it would continue to crop up with all manner of insurgent forces for decades. Into the later years of the Cold War, the DShK soldiered on as the Second World's answer to the M2 Browning, and eventually even found the soldiers of its homeland in its sights. Concurrently with the war in Vietnam, the DShK had served in similar roles during the civil wars in neighbouring Laos and Cambodia, the clashes between Indonesia and Malaysia, the First Civil War in Sudan, the Third and Fourth Wars between the Arabs and Israelis, the communist insurgency in Thailand, along with the South African Border War and the Bush War in Rhodesia, to name a few. DShKs even clashed against each other during Vietnam's own conflicts with both China and Cambodia. But certainly, the most significant use of the weapon during this period came against the Soviets themselves during their ill-fated invasion of Afghanistan. While the Soviets continued to use their heavy machine guns here, mostly mounted on vehicles and Mi-24 gunships, the opposing Mujahideen had similar successes to the Viet Cong, using the weapon to harass convoys and helicopters. For these purposes, the Mujahideen captured many DShKs from the Afghan and Red Armies, along with obtaining a number of Type 54s from the USSR's former ally, China. For a fighting force well versed in Afghanistan's mountainous terrain, the Mujahideen were excellent at emplacing the DShK in highly advantageous positions, on well-covered hillsides or the mouths of caves, where they could open fire on passing helicopters with little risk of effective return fire. While the Mi-24 Hind was much more resilient against the DShK, the lighter Mi-8 Transport was especially vulnerable to the 50 cal, and just as with Hueys in Vietnam, many were downed by DShK fire during the Soviet invasion. In the midst and wake of the Soviets' own quagmire, the DShK continued to find use in an array of conflicts around the globe. Both sides of the Iran-Iraq war utilized their own copies of the DShK throughout the 80s, along with the machine gun finding use in a plethora of civil conflicts in Somalia, Liberia, Ethiopia, Lebanon, and Sri Lanka. Even the IRA got their hands on the DShK through contacts in Libya, which they used to shoot down British helicopters and damage their trucks, most famously shooting down a Lynx helicopter in 1988. From then on, the DShK became the favoured anti-tea drinker weapon for the IRA. However, by the time the USSR collapsed, the DShK had already been out of official production for just over a decade, and was slowly being superseded by more modern weapons like the NSV and Type 77. The DShK was an artifact of a bygone era, but even through to today, it still serves on the front lines of modern conflicts. As the Cold War gave way to the modern era, the DShK has persisted as a cheap and reliable heavy machine gun, most commonly seen with insurgent forces. In the last nearly 40 years, the Americans have run into the DShK pretty much every time they've taken yet another excursion to the Middle East, during Desert Storm, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, along with the Syrian Civil War. Both Taliban and anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan had immense success operating almost identically to the preceding Mujahideen, setting up DShKs in well-protected caves and mountainous positions to target convoys and helicopters. The Taliban also often set them up overlooking coalition airbases and targeted aircraft as they took off or landed. The DShK saw similar use in Iraq, though Iraqi DShKs were more often mounted on trucks than in well-concealed positions. Over in Syria, pretty much every local faction involved made some use of the robust Soviet design. Some used it against the aircraft of the Assad regime, some iconically mounted on Toyota pickup trucks, and some even mounted on motorcycles by anti-ISIS insurgents, which must have been absolutely insane to drive. As it relates to pickups though, this seems to be the preferred use case in the modern day, with forces of all kinds across Africa, the Middle East and Central Asia all building so-called technicals for a highly mobile and powerful gun platform. Hell, just throw it on a shopping trolley and it'll work just fine apparently. The most recent adaptations for modern warfare have been born out of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Breaking open their stockpiles inherited from the corpse of the USSR, the Ukrainians have developed a modified variant since 2014, featuring a larger muzzle brake, pistol grip, shoulder stock, and bipod for use in trenches. As drones have entered the picture, similar to the M2, the DShK has also been employed to deal with the new aerial threat, with the Ukrainians also hopping on the technical train to this end. While it has been supplanted in Russian service by the NSV and more recent Cord 6P50, many former Second World nations continue to produce and use DShK clones, including China, Albania, the Czech Republic, Iran, Pakistan, and Romania. It is certainly slowly falling out of use, but as evidenced by its use in both Ukraine and Gaza, it still has something left in the tank. And the ability to cheaply destroy materiel, and now drones, is something the DShK will likely continue to provide for some more time to come. It's been a constant, if underappreciated, staple of combat for the last 80 years, and although it had an underwhelming start, the DShK has left an undeniable mark on military history. With the history of the DShK mostly covered, let's address the all-important question. How does it stack up against the M2 Browning? Well, for starters, the DShK offers a higher fire rate, around 600 rounds per minute over the Browning, which typically clocks between 450 and 550 rounds per minute. In combat conditions, the DShK still remains on top in this regard, clocking in at about 125 rounds per minute compared to the Browning's roughly 40 rounds per minute. While the 12.7 by 108mm cartridge is slightly longer than the 50 BMG, both perform effectively identically, and in fact they're so similar that there is a long-standing myth that they're interchangeable. They're not, in case you were wondering. In most every other factor though, the Browning comes out on top. While its base weight is slightly higher, on their standard infantry mounts, the M2 is lighter, more stable, and overall just more accurate. Its recoil is also vastly more manageable, with the DShK often described as having a violent, jarring, and disruptive kick to it, as opposed to the M2's comparatively smoother recoil. The Browning has also been much more versatile, serving aboard an array of tanks, boats, helicopters, and planes over the course of its life. Though, in fairness, the DShK has had a similar impact on a diverse, albeit smaller, array of vehicles itself. Both weapons and their ammunition have been in use for over 80 years, but in terms of sheer numbers, there exists almost 3 times as many M2s as DShKs. If I'm being completely honest though, these two weapons are much more similar than they are different. I mean, they both have near identical origins and combat histories, and they also both helped spawn a specialized anti-materiel rifle in the same caliber. Regardless of how they may differ, they both deserve recognition for their near century-long service, as well as their continued effectiveness through to today. These two aging warriors have fought with and against each other in countless conflicts for decades, and at this point, it's less a question of which one is better, and more of which one will outlive the other. I know who I'm hedging my bet on, but that's just me. Since the Second World War, there has barely been a conflict that the DShK hasn't been a part of in some capacity, and in all that time, it still seems to live in the shadow of the Browning M2. Poor production numbers during World War II crippled its chances of ever gaining the same reverence the Browning has earned, but in the years since, the over 1 million DShKs produced and usage by some 100 nations have more than closed the gap between it and its American rival. Throughout the Cold War and into the modern era, the DShK has been the only weapon to truly rival the M2, both in numbers produced and its impact on the battlefield. and what an impact it's had. There has scarcely been a weapon that posed as much of a threat to aircraft for so long as has the DShK, and it could even be argued that it was the DShK that contributed most to America's embarrassment in Vietnam. Whenever and wherever it's been needed, the DShK has answered the call resoundingly, and while it has been replaced and supplanted in many regards, the old Soviet mule still finds a way to keep itself in the fight. There is no telling what might be next for the DShK. With the onset of drone warfare, the DShK has certainly bought itself some more time, but whether its newfound purposes will last remains to be seen. Whatever lies ahead for the Soviet 50 cal, the DShK will always have its 80 years of experience to offer, along with its power, sturdiness, and reliability. So, with all that said, which do you think is better, the M2 or the DShK? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments. Likes and comments both really help the channel, so either would be much appreciated. Anyways, if you've enjoyed this video and want to learn more, my sources, as always, will be in the description. Thank you so very much for watching, that's all from me for now, and I'll see you in the next one.